Hi, everyone. I'm Cassidy from Centrifuge, as mentioned. We actually started off working in Berlin at Full Node, the Gnosis co-working space. So it's nice to give this talk here in Berlin, although we're actually based all around the world now. Centrifuge is real-world asset financing on-chain. And today I want to talk about DAO treasury management, which I think has always been a really important topic, but it's newly relevant. And today I'm going to go into exactly why that is. So first off, what is DAO treasury management? It's really, I think, based on the fact that most of our DAOs have native tokens. And they mint those native tokens oftentimes to actually fund development of what the purpose of the DAO is. So DAO treasury is usually made up of those native tokens, and oftentimes they do a token sale and actually get other types of assets. So DAO treasuries are made up of their native token, probably making up a big chunk of it still these days, but also stable coins, ETH, Bitcoin even times. And so the DAO treasury management itself is really all of the activities that are involved in custody of those assets, the strategy of how to manage those assets, and then the actual trading or management of the funds themselves that are held by the DAO. And I think what's unique about DAO treasury management as compared to traditional corporations is that there's a little bit of a different mandate when it comes to a DAO. So just like other corporations that have a treasury, you're obviously managing your liquidity and you're managing your risk. So that means that you're really planning for the current needs of the DAO, what your short-term spending is going to be in the next year or so. But you're interested in also having capital preservation strategies to make sure that the DAO can really fund itself into the long term and fulfill its mission. Because most of our DAOs do have long-term missions, right? But I think what's unique really about DAOs in particular compared to traditional corporations is that they really do have a core mission that tends to be crypto native in nature. And really the management of the treasury should be aligned with what the DAO itself is trying to accomplish. And oftentimes that means supporting its own ecosystem. So in the example of, let's say, Ethereum, the Ethereum Foundation would probably want to put a lot of its ETH into supporting projects within its ecosystem, right? So I think when it comes to the management of a DAO treasury, we do see a little bit of a different approach. And that's why I think approaching this as a manager for a DAO treasury is a really unique problem that a traditional manager for a corporation's treasury wouldn't necessarily fully understand the needs of the DAO and be able to employ a strategy that meets both of these things. So when a DAO is actually deciding its goals, deciding how to deploy a strategy, I think there's really three buckets that we can look at when we're looking at portfolio allocation. So that's, again, this liquidity portion of what are the short-term needs of the DAO, how much money are they going to have to spend on developing the protocol this year, right? How can they pay out the grants that they've given to teams, different development teams, auditing teams, whatever have you for the DAO? You need to understand what that looks like in the short term and be able to have a liquidity strategy to actually meet that. But then on the other hand, you probably will also want to have preservation and appreciation strategies to be able to actually have the DAO treasury either grow or not be depleted too much to be able to fulfill its long-term visions. So I think these three buckets are really what we're looking at in terms of how managers today for a DAO are looking at deploying their capital. And oftentimes, or at least up until this point, that's really been only crypto-native strategies that they've looked at. And so right now, when we're looking at DAO treasury management, it tends to be pretty simple, and it's usually just holding a stablecoin as part of having that liquidity, and actually deploying pretty leveraged, sometimes risky crypto-native strategies. And I think what we're looking at Centrifuge, and what I'd like to dive into a little bit more today, is being able to take a step back from only looking at the crypto-native side. And I think the reason for that is really because of what's happened in the market, right? So we had this amazing bull market where we saw DeFi TVL shot up, and that is where these crypto-native strategies were really useful. And I think made these DAO treasuries grow quite a bit. And I think it was actually a really great time for a lot of these teams to start deploying a lot of these, or really synthesizing the governance process around how we decide what a DAO is going to do with its treasury. And so I think this bull market was extremely meaningful in really building that infrastructure, giving teams a reason to work on the legal infrastructure, the active managers to come into the space, because there was a real opportunity to provide value here to these DAOs, and also developing the governance process to go along with both of those things. But unfortunately now, in the bear market, I think it's really an important time to start zooming out of just these crypto native strategies. And the reason is that DeFi yields are just lower than TradFi yields right now. So I think this is the reason why we've actually seen quite an explosion in interest for US Treasuries. I think this is something that's more interesting than a lot of DeFi yields right now. But I do think there's much more beyond just relying on something like US Treasuries to diversify a DAO treasury into as well. But this is just an example of what we're seeing happen in the market today. So I just wanted to, bring up this point of, well, if all of these DAOs understand this, it's a well-understood problem. Why don't I see a lot of activity happening in DAO treasury management right now where they're actually starting to diversify out of crypto? And I do think a huge reason for that is the fact that we just did not have the tools yet. Why now? We actually have a stack available for these DAOs to do what they need to do to actually actively manage that treasury. What does this stack look like? I mean, it's teams like Safe that actually have real custody solutions that I would say are finally getting into a place that's institutional grade. I mean, a place where an institution that has a legal mandate to have proper management of its funds can actually start using Safe to custody those assets. We have governance. I think Gnosis actually is doing a lot of really interesting work here that I'll dive into in a few minutes, of actually developing a sort of standard, we could call it maybe, of how to actually have governance around how to deploy your treasury. We've got stablecoins like Maker's DAI. Aave's just launched Aave Go. We've got managers like Karpatki that are going to be talking on the panel right after me, reporting like Steakhouse Financial, and then Centrifuge, we're really focused on real-world assets. And another thing that we've really tried developing together with Maker is also this legal aspect. So I think three really key elements within this stack that I'd like to touch on a little bit deeper are the portfolio allocation that we focus on with Centrifuge, the legal infrastructure that a lot of teams are really focused on developing, and this DAO governance aspect. So for this portfolio allocation piece, we've launched Centrifuge Prime. We've really built this specifically for DeFi native organizations. And one of the things that really outlines this is this work that we've done on a DAO legal wrapper. I think what's really important to point out here is that creating something, some sort of legal structure for a DAO should never be a legal structure that encompasses the entire DAO. It's really a specific entity for one piece, one purpose that's specific within the DAO. And the important thing there is that you don't want to have the liability of whatever this legal entity is doing carry over to any other DAO participants, and also vice versa. You don't want anything else that the DAO is doing to then allow any regulator to target this legal entity just for something that someone else in the DAO is doing. So it's really important here to have a legal structure that's really narrow in its purpose and specifically focused on, in this case, allocating a portfolio of the DAO's assets. And so that's something that I think is still in development, probably working together with regulators to improve and improve. But I think we've got something here that, Maker's happy to use, at least for now. And I think more and more DAOs are going to start to employ this to basically enable their on-chain treasuries to be able to invest in assets off-chain, and even invest actually in other on-chain assets in a more legally compliant way. So that legal infrastructure, I think, is really key. But the other aspect of Centrifuge Prime is really our bread and butter, which is this ability to really diversify the portfolio of a DAO into different types of real-world assets. So again, looking at those other buckets that we looked at earlier, liquidity, preservation, acceleration, being able to have a portfolio allocation strategy that invests in all types of different real-world assets. Another thing that we've brought into our ecosystem is what we call the credit group. And these are a group of credit and finance experts that really will help to inform DAO treasury managers and work with them on hopefully creating a strategy that really works for this DAO and being able to understand how these assets fit into that strategy. So when we think about portfolio allocation, a lot of that should really happen within the DAO and in that governance process, and that's that process that I think we're still seeing develop. But the DAO should allocate to the different buckets of these real-world assets. So for example, maybe they would decide to have a specific allocation of the DAO, maybe let's say 10% of the DAO's assets they want to deploy to different types of real-world assets. Of that bucket, maybe they want to put 70% into US Treasuries and 30% into other types of credit. And so the DAO will have a vote to actually decide on that allocation. This allocation can then be worked on together with the treasury manager of the DAO, together with the Centrifuge Credit Group as an example, to really decide exactly what kind of strategy to employ. But it really then comes down to DAO governance to actually approve what those strategies are in a vote. And then, using Centrifuge Prime, be able to automatically allocate that portfolio the way the DAO has actually governed on-chain. So I think what we're trying to do here is take what we see in TradFi, but really bring that on-chain, I mean truly on-chain, where you have the DAO really governing down to the T exactly how you're deploying these assets, and be able to have this automated in a way that is ideally trustless to the extent that you know as a token holder that your decisions are actually being employed without you needing to double check on them. It's all happening trustlessly on-chain. I think the governance aspect here is a really interesting one that we're still developing. And I wanted to highlight a couple examples of how that's going. So one of those is a Steakhouse Financial, this reporting proposal that they made to ENS. And I think ENS has actually done a lot of really interesting work in creating a governance process to really facilitate how they're managing their treasury. So that was a really good example that I think if you want to take a look, something really interesting to get into. And another team, obviously here at DappCon, Gnosis, is really, I think, leading the way in terms of having a robust governance process around how they govern their DAO treasury. And so this is a proposal here from Karpatki, one of those active managers, that's working with the Gnosis DAO to create, together with the DAO, together with the token holders, a strategy that works for those token holders, that is aligned both to the mission of Gnosis, but also able to employ strategies that would preserve their capital in the long term, preserve their liquidity for the short term. So I think this is actually, for me, one of the key examples of creating a standard, hopefully, for other DAOs to follow in step of what Gnosis is doing, learn from them, and understand that this is all something that can actually happen on-chain. I think one thing that's really interesting about Karpatki and the way they work with Gnosis is that they use another Gnosis team called Zodiac to actually, on-chain, have a clear mandate that the DAO is actually able to set. And it's completely enforced on-chain, where Karpatki is not able to actually employ strategies that have not been decided by the DAO through this governance process. So I think this whole progress that we're seeing with all three of these things, this legal infrastructure that we're developing, the portfolio allocation that you can now do with Centrifuge, and this DAO governance that teams like Gnosis are really leading the way in, I think these are really key areas that we're seeing of development where we are in a new time, where this has always been an issue for DAOs. This is always something that DAOs have wanted to do something about. Newly in the bear market, really looking at assets that are outside of the crypto native place, but really because we have the tools. Both of those things are, I think, really key reasons why right now we're seeing a lot of growth in this area. We're seeing a lot of DAOs actually really start to go into this direction of deciding how to allocate portions of their treasury to real-world assets. And I think, for me, that's really exciting, obviously, working at Centrifuge. But I do think one of the key things here is that we make sure we're continuing to do this on-chain. We're not just replicating what traditional finance is doing. We're not just replicating the way that corporations today manage their treasuries. We're actually building new tools and new infrastructure to be able to do this in a transparent and in a trustless way so that DAOs can meet their needs to be responsible stewards of capital for the DAO, but do it in a way that's actually happening as trustless as it can be on-chain with these new pieces of infrastructure. So that's all I've got for today, but I do have a few minutes for questions.
Thank you, Cassidy. We have a few minutes for questions. Over here. We have a microphone, so just give us 1 second.
Hi there. Yeah, I think you mentioned at the start of your talk that a lot of the treasuries have their, it's stored in their native token. So I wanted to know if you could go a little into depth on how you convert the native token to something else, which is more liquid, and then you finally take it onto real world without like having a price impact on the token in some way.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think a lot of teams are always thinking about that. There's a few different ways that a DAO could go about this, depending on how much liquidity there is for their native token. So, there's one bucket of DAOs that might have a high volume of trading for their token. They could actually probably use like an OTC desk in this case to work with another team that would be able to very slowly trade that token for a stablecoin, for example. So, but that's really only limited to very large DAOs that have highly liquid tokens and large token volumes on the market. In the case of most DAOs, I'd say they probably fall into a different type of bucket, which is really that they end up doing things like private sales to key investors, or doing a public sale where the native token is then locked over 2 years, for example. So you see both of these different examples now, and these are in existing teams. Obviously, a new team generally ends up starting off with some sort of a private sale or public sale as well. But I think the key there, like to your question of not moving the token price too much, I think is having either really high token volumes so that the price isn't moving very much, or locked tokens when you are selling them.
Have another question for Cassidy? If not, we'll wrap it up there. Thank you so much, Cassidy, for your time. And next up, we have a panel discussion. We'll take a short break, and we'll switch out the stage and then kick it off to round out this section of talks for today. Thank you so much, Cassidy.
Thank you.